right, welcome to the lesson on solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So far we have talked about how to solve a quadratic equation by graphing it and finding where it crosses over the x-axis. And we have also talked about how to do it with square roots. So today what we're going to do is we're going to learn our third way to solve a quadratic equation, and that is by completing the square. All right, so for an expression in the form x squared plus bx, you can add a constant c to the expression so that the expression is x squared plus bx plus c. So that x squared plus bx plus c should look very familiar. That is what we used when we were talking about factoring our polynomial in or trinomial in our last chapter. So this should be very familiar to you. This is also, if we put a little a in front of that x squared, that's also the quadratic function equation that you always see in order to graph it. So what we're going to do when we complete the square is we are going to use this formula right here to practice solving for a quadratic equation. So this b divided by 2 squared is going to be very, very important. That's going to be your best friend throughout this entire section. So let's look at an equation so you kind of know what I'm talking about. So it says find the value of c, so that last term, that makes the expression x squared plus 5x plus c a perfect square trinomial. Remember, a perfect square trinomial is something like x plus 4 squared. Okay, that's considered a perfect square trinomial. Okay, in factored form. So we are going to write our equation, and then we're going to get it into this form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the value of c. In order to find the value of c, I am going to use that b over 2 and that whole thing squared to solve it. Okay, so my b in this case is 5. So that is why I'm going to do 5 divided by 2 squared. Now I am going to avoid using decimals in this case at the beginning, just because I don't want to make it more complicated as I go through the problem. So I'm going to keep it as a fraction. So I'm going to apply the squared to the numerator and to the denominator of my fraction. So 5 squared is 25, 2 squared is 4. So that is my c term. So if I were to write this into my, or substitute c into my original equation, it's going to look like x squared plus 5x plus 25 over 4. Okay, so that is the first part of my equation, where it says, or my question, where it says, find the value of c to make a perfect square trinomial. I just made a perfect square trinomial. Okay, the next step is to write it in this factored form. And a really good trick to know is that you do not have to go through and do our big complicated factoring part, especially considering we have a fraction here. This b over 2, before you square it, can become my term that I'm going to use, just like this. So if you remember, 5 divided by 2 is my b divided by 2, my b over 2. That is going to become my answer right here, where I go x plus b over 2 squared. Right, so that's all that we have to do for that section of, for the beginning part of completing the square. So let's do another couple examples to try this out. So let's say I have x squared plus 8x plus c, and I'm doing the same process that I did in the previous example. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my b over 2, and I'm going to square it. So my b is 8. So I'm going to go 8 over 2. And I'm going to square it. So 8 divided by 2 equals 4. So I'm just going to write 4 squared. I couldn't do that in the last problem because it didn't go out evenly. So 4 squared is 16. So if I were to write my perfect square trinomial, it would be x squared plus 8x plus 16. And if I were to write that as a perfect square binomial, it would be x. Again, I'm going to use my b divided by 2, so that would be 4. So I'm going to say plus 4 and square it. Okay. So my suggestion to you would be to pause the video at this point and try number 2 and try number 3 on your own. And then when you resume, just check to see if your answers are correct. I'm just going to write down the answers for you. Okay. So number 2, it would be x squared minus 12x. And my c term would be 36. So then my factored form would be x minus 6 squared. Okay. And then my number 3, my perfect square, is x squared plus 3x plus 9 over 4. So then my completing the square is going to be x, or my square of my binomial is going to be x plus 3 over 2 squared. All right, so hopefully you got what I got. If you didn't, go back and check your work. Make sure that you're getting to this point because this is like step 1 of completing the square, okay? Understanding this concept. So our next step for completing the square is just going to make, is going to get it so I am finding my zeros, or where my x-axis, or where my parabola is crossing over the x-axis. All right, so you can use completing the square with any quadratic equation ever, which is what it says up here, okay? And I'm going to go through the different steps for this. This is long. This can look confusing, but I promise that you will be able to figure it out. Okay, you just need to practice this, okay? So the first step that I am going to do when completing the square is I am going to look and see if I can factor anything out of my trinomial, okay? In this case, I want to get rid of this 2, okay? So I'm going to factor that 2 out first, and I'm going to end up with x squared plus 10x minus 4, and that all equals 0, okay? This 2 in the front, we can just disregard it. It kind of just goes away, okay? We factored it out, we're fine. All right, the next step is I need to get it in the form of x squared plus bx equals d, meaning that I need to get my c term over to the other side, okay? So I'm going to say x squared plus 10x and I am going to equal that to 4, okay? That's my next step. Now, I left a big gap because this is where I'm going to add my C term that I'm going to find by doing B over 2 and squaring it. So my B term in this case is 10, okay? So I'm going to do 10 divided by 2, and that's going to be squared. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5, so I'm going to end up with 5 squared, which is 25. Okay. Ooh, rough 25. So now I'm going to take this term right here, and I'm going to plug it into my C areas. Now, whatever I do on this side of the equal sign, just like we did way back when we solved equations, I have to do to this side of the equation. So I'm going to add 25, and I'm going to add 25. Okay? All right, so now I'm going to ignore this 4 plus 25 for a moment, and I'm just going to concentrate on this side. And I'm going to do what I did in our previous examples, and I'm going to get this side of the equation to look like this, okay, to that square binomial part. So I'm going to do x, and remember I can just use my b over 2 section for my next term. So I'm just going to say x plus 5 squared. Oops. Put my parentheses in the wrong spot. And then I'm going to equal that to 4 plus 25, which is 29. Now I'm going to solve this as if it were a normal equation. So I want to get rid of this squared. And like we learned in the last section, the opposite of squaring something is square rooting it. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to make this the square root of 29. Okay, so now I have x plus 5 equals, and I'm going to say it's plus or minus the square root of 29, because remember we can either have both terms be positive or negative, okay? And at this point, I just want to get my x by itself, and I can actually create two different equations. I can create one where I'm adding the square root of 29, or I can create one where I'm subtracting the square root of 29, okay? So I'm going to say I have the square root of 29 minus 5. And I'm going to say I have the negative square root of 29. And I'm going to add 5, or subtract 5, sorry. Whew. Subtract 5, okay? Now I'm going to take these two terms, and I can do one of two things. I can leave them like this, which is very commonly done because there's not an exact answer to this, like not a pretty number, it's going to be some sort of decimal, or I can just plug it into the calculator and solve. So if I were to plug this into the calculator and solve, I would end up with, I think this is 0.39, and this guy is negative 10.39. All right, so that was a lot of steps, a lot of steps. I understand it's a lot of steps. We're going to try one more, and then so what I'm going to do is I'm going to challenge you to try this by yourself first, okay? Remember, these steps for this are factor out a greatest common factor if you can. All right. Then you're going to add or subtract the C term to the other side of the equal sign. Then you are going to figure out your b over 2 squared term, and you're going to add that to both sides of your equation. And then you're going to put the one side in factored form. I'm going to say factored form. And then I'm going to simply solve my two equations. All right, so I'm going to do this one again. I would, again, say try and maybe do it without, like by pausing me and trying it by yourself. But then go back and make sure you're understanding it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out this 3 because I can factor out the 3. And if I factor out the 3, I'm going to end up with that goes away because that just becomes 1. Negative 24 is going to become negative 8. And then 27 is going to become 9. So my new equation is going to be g squared minus 8g plus 9. Oops. And I'm just going to go like this so you can see the original equation. And that equals 0. I'm then going to subtract my 9 over here. That's the term. So I'm going to go g squared minus 8g, leave some room, equals negative 9. And I'm going to have some room for that. So then I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to do my b over 2 squared. So I'm going to do negative 8 over 2. I'm going to square that. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And then I'm going to square that. And that's going to become 16, positive 16. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. And add 16. And I'm going to put this side in factored form. So I'm going to do g. I can use my b over 2 term, which is my negative 4, and square it. And that's going to equal negative 9 plus 16, which is 7. And then I'm going to get rid of that, square this side. So now I have g minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. And now I'm going to write my two equations. I either have the square root of 7 plus 4, or I have the negative square root of 7 plus 4. And then I can either leave them like this or I can type them into the calculator. If I type them into the calculator, I am going to get, this first one is 6. I'm rounding to 0.65. And the second one, if I type it in, which I'm doing right now, is negative Square root of 7 minus plus 4. So that one is going to be 1.35. So 6.65 or 6 and 65 hundredths and 1.35 or 1 and 35 hundredths. All right. That's completing the square. Please come to school with any, or to class with any questions. Remember, this is a process and it's going to take a little while, and I promise you'll be able to get it. All right? See you later.